Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Pi Podcast. This is purely audio. We're not going to record our faces because this is the first in person podcast. It's the 11th episode, and well, the usual people aren't here either. We have a new guest, Salar. Um, and the thing I wanted to talk about today was the idea of false order. And by that I mean discussing different forms of government and basically try to understand like my point of view that there is no efficient way of ruling. All of them are flawed, especially the ones like followed today. For example, democracy. People tend to like it because it gives them a sense of like power, that they're responsible. They have some power in ruling of their country, like choosing who to run and different things. But in the end, it's just all flawed. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think building on what you said about democracy being flawed, I think 1 or 2 months ago I had a discussion with my father about the upcoming elections, and I asked him, who do you think you'd vote for? And he said, um, I remember he brought up the fact that his uncle was running for a particular party. And then when I asked him how that's relevant, he said, well, obviously my vote would go to him. But that sort of made me think, yeah, at the end of the day, especially in countries like Pakistan, like we were talking about this yesterday as well, we don't look at the policies of the upcoming governments. We don't look at what kind of a leader that man will be. We more so look at the power that our family will gain, or our tribe will gain, or an individual close to us will gain through our vote, as opposed to what our country will gain, what its people will gain in the next 50 to 100 years from this rule. Um, and so I think it's a very I think it's a feudalist mindset, especially when you look in Pakistan and its history, or the subcontinent's history, the tribal system and everything. I think it's still heavily ingrained within us, and that sort of impairs our judgment when it comes down to democracy. Because at the end of the day, if you look at the very root, the poor man will vote for the party that gives him food, that gives him shelter, that gives him some sort of comfort or security. Um, and I feel like even if that man is bad for society, but he's good for the poor man, that man will come into power. In a country like Pakistan, there's so many other factors involved, such as corruption, rigging, etc. But I think that's where it all stems.
In terms of like, so even in a democracy, when someone comes, I think a lot of their energy goes towards bringing out reforms, etc., to kind of weaken their opposition so that they're in power longer. Or in our country's history, most of our leaders do things for personal gain. In terms of making changes to weaken the opposition, it's just like a childish play for power, because in the end, you're not doing anything for the country. And Joe, like the assemblies we have, the councils we have, within them they have a voting system that makes bringing about reforms and changes very difficult, because different people have different reasons for running for an election or getting that leadership position. A lot of people are there to gain like money and power, and so they would never let a new law or reform pass that is actually beneficial for the common man. In our country, a lot of times we hear our parents say that education is important, and a lot of these big leaders don't want education, especially landlords, because then the people will realize that that whole system is flawed and then work against it, and so the landlords would lose power. So if you have all of these landlords in your assembly and someone brings about the idea of bringing a reform that increases education or whatnot, which could probably be an amazing change for the country, bring about a lot of positive changes, they'd vote against it. And if they're in the majority, that rule would never pass. So I think in a democracy, you have so many different candidates, so many different parties, that at the end, even if you elect the guy who's good for you, most of the changes he wants to bring, he can't do that. and it's just a futile effort to change the country. Each time you think, okay, I'll vote for someone different, he'll bring about changes, but corruption and that greed for power is so like deeply instilled within our government that even if someone new comes with different ideas, they're going to be held back. And although I think there is no best way of rule, and you know how America tried to impose like democracy in each and every country, Joby, I still think there's a different form of rule for different times and different people. Uh, an uneducated country like Pakistan, I don't think democracy is a good way, because people don't really focus on reforms, people don't look at the bigger picture, and they just vote for who's going to bring about immediate changes for them. Like Nawaz Sharif's government, they brought in things like infrastructure and roads, which was visible changes. So people thought they were doing amazing work. And I'm not here to speak against or for any political candidate, but you see a lot of these trends in our country. So I think giving power to such people is not the best thing. And in my view, some sort of dictatorship would be good in Pakistan. But dictatorship is such a weird system itself as well, because once a person is chosen to lead, he's going to stay there. And if the wrong person is put up in that leadership role, you're screwed. And you can't do anything to change that. In democracy, at least, like your government changes every 4 to 5 years. So if shit's going bad, though, you can at least look for the future and be like, something's gonna change. But you know how they say in Pakistan, people are run through the stick. Like you have to physically enforce particular rules and laws and make them follow it. And even at a smaller level, you can see that in our schools, no one really follows any rules until and unless you bring in severe punishments or instill some sort of fear. That way it's good, but it's just a very confusing thing. Everything has a lot of pros, but a lot of cons as well. And I think it changes over time. And like, I don't know, it's just confusing.
I think this idea of the power of people, as we were talking about it previously, you sort of veered away from it. But people having power, I remember when I used to live in the UK, the Brexit referendum was happening, and the government gave this task of voting for whether staying in the European Union or leaving. They gave this task to the public, and the public had to then decide something that would determine the entire future of the nation, economically speaking. They give it for the people to decide, and now these people, to be quite honest, they don't know what's going on. I mean, they don't look through the economic policy, they don't look through the consequences, economically speaking. It's more so at the time they vote for a leader, call them the equivalent of, well, slightly the equivalent of Nawaz Sharif in the UK, Nigel Farage, the owner of the UKIP party. The majority of the elders in the UK voted for that man, not because of his policy, but more so because they thought that they were reclaiming their land. And in the same way in Pakistan, they were reclaiming that sort of inherent right that they thought they had to some sort of individual power. And I think in Pakistan, it's similar in the sense that, well, especially in my family, we vote for people to try to reclaim the individual power we had. And so I think the best way to get rid of this problem is a meritocracy, which is it's used a lot in China, and that is the reason for China's success, politically speaking, economically speaking, in the last 60, 70 years. It's a meritocracy. I think it's a very interesting form of government, especially because then you give power of vote to the people who know what they're doing.
Can you explain what that is? Because I don't know what it is, like that form of government.
So meritocracy is basically, it is not, you can't replace a democracy with a meritocracy. Meritocracy is like an addition, or it's like an accessory. A meritocracy is basically based on the idea that you gain power or you gain influence through merit, generally speaking. Merit, whether that be academic, academic. In some countries, it's even, you look at it in Pakistan, you look at Maulvis, traditionally speaking, in the religious sense, it is still a meritocracy. Ill-perceived meritocracy, but nevertheless, that's the system that they're trying to follow, whether they know it or not. Um, so yeah, I think.
Another thing I wanted to bring up, which is kind of connected to your idea, the people elected in countries like Pakistan or America or Joby, they're very well-off people generally. It's very rare that someone from the streets grows up and gets to that position of leadership, which I think is important, because the people we elect nowadays, the people running for office, are privileged individuals. They don't understand the struggles or the daily experiences of the common man. And for Pakistan, the common man is poor. Like, I used to conduct charity work in one of the slums in Karachi. That that exposed me to a lot of things, a lot of problems that are not solved. And then I compared to the problems us privileged individuals complain about, which could be changed by the government. To be honest, the needs of the common man are more valuable because they're more based around the necessities of life. And I think whoever we elect isn't isn't aware of all of those problems, isn't aware of the day-to-day struggles and the difficulties the common man faces. And so I think a merit type system would work a lot, because let's say everyone stands on equal ground and you have to work in specific departments for the government, for the country, in civil service or what's up, and that makes you eligible to run for office. So for example, someone in that process has to work minimal jobs as well, like very basic desk jobs, or uh, like on field work of going and surveying these local places. There should be like a credit system that you have to go through to be able to run for office. That way you're aware of different things. Like a person who is running for prime minister in Pakistan should have to go through a process where they're exposed to different offices. Like, they should work in the agriculture department for a bit, they should work in the healthcare department for a bit, the education for a bit, or is tarah ka कि that way they can develop experience and be exposed to different problems in each and every area, and then they can be like running for prime minister.
But do you think, given the short period in which they are leader of the country, don't you think it would be better for the nation if they are heavily informed in one area that they can accelerate during that period, 4 years, 8 years, however long they are? And then like that, so I mean, similarly speaking, a meritocracy, but each time you sort of look towards a different section of it. Speaking, like, let's say somebody very well informed in agriculture comes in and they heavily accelerate the agriculture industry in Pakistan to the point where, raise exports, try to come up with new and more productive forms of production that end up increasing the welfare of agriculture in Pakistan. And that, because we rely on our primary sector so heavily, I think that would be better for the entire nation in all aspects. So I think if you accelerate one area, that eventually that would help each and every other area instead of being very well informed in each thing separately.
That's a fair point, but then I think if you have that form, the ministers you have for each and every field, like the Minister of Education, Minister of Health, Minister of Tech and Science, Joby, they should be specialized in the thing they're leading. Like, if you're appointing someone as the education minister, like the education minister we have right now, probably not the best. I think for specialized ministries, you should have that merit system then in that particular field. Like, if someone wants to become the education minister, they need to have experience in that field, and only then they can be appointed for that particular area. And although this is a very complex system, it would be interesting that, for example, for someone, people should run individually for each office. So, and people allowed to vote for that particular individual should be from that field. So if someone runs for the Minister of Agriculture, they should have experience in agriculture, and there should be a separate election for that position. And the only people who can vote for that are people like farmers or people in that area, because those people know how that system is run. They know the changes that need to be made. And that way, each individual you elect is specialized for that particular area and is chosen by the people of that particular area. And in that way, in each and every field, your government is going to be strong. But the only problem with that is, like, if individuals chosen for each of these leadership positions are from different parties with different motives, there wouldn't be that much harmony within the government. There wouldn't be what you'd call chemistry between the leaders, and they could cause problems there. But it would be an interesting idea to have these specialized individuals in specialized areas.
The thing you mentioned about parties, I mean, recently a lot I've been thinking, and this could be very flawed thinking, but I'm going to say it nevertheless. I think the whole idea of having one party that represents the opinion of an individual who has such a multitude of different ideas, one party summing that up, I don't think it serves justice to the idea of democracy, because at the end of the day, you're not voting for ideals or a nation that you want specifically or that you would think is the best for a nation, but you're given 3 or 4 options, 2 of which are legible, the other 2 are not going to come into power. You can vote for them, but then they're not going to lead the nation. And in the case for me, like in the upcoming elections, there are 3 parties which I think will come into power. I'm not the type of individual who votes for a party knowing that they're not going to come into power, because I want some sort of say in who leads my nation, right? But at the same time, the ideals or the wants of each party does not serve justice to the nation or to the poor men of the nation, the poor men and women of the nation. And I think it's sort of the whole idea of a party, in my opinion, is kind of flawed. I think it should be more so you vote for an individual, because an individual you can get behind. If you look at recent history, if you look at German history, for example, or yesterday we were talking about Hitler, or I think it was this morning we were talking about Hitler and the great economic advances he made for Germany before he started killings of Jews, etc. But in that sense, people did not initially get behind the Nazi party themselves. If you look through your history textbooks, they got behind Hitler as an individual, as a leader, when he came into power. That was something that brought together the German people. I think similarly, if we have such a reform in Pakistan, an individual who comes and someone that is well spoken. You see, this is why I have a problem also with something you mentioned about somebody coming out of the, like somebody from a farm leading the agriculture industry. The thing about that is, of course, it would be efficient, but at what point does bias become so large that it's sort of, because you have to look at your own interests as well. And with these farmers, generally speaking, if they've grown up in a village, they would have certain, I mean, this is very generalized speaking, but you grow up with certain tendencies or a certain mindset that could affect your decision making. And when it comes to such a large national scale, a small degree of bias can ruin everything, and it can lead to all these inefficiencies that we now have in a nation like Pakistan. So I think I'm going off on a tangent, but yeah, I mean, generally speaking, again, just coming back to the point, instead of parties, I think we should vote for individuals, because with individuals you have some realistic sense of hope, because you know what that man or woman brings to the table.
Okay, kind of going off topic now. Considering all of these systems have flaws, and even the suggestions we gave would probably, while putting it into practice, would have a lot of flaws as well. Do you think humans would be better off as hunter-gatherers? Because as hunter-gatherers, you're not really united, and so you wouldn't make as much advances in terms of in terms of a society, like technological advances, economic advances, all of that, everyone's just an individual group. Do you think that'd be better off than like the type of governments and the type of society we have right now?
Are you saying that a current nation would become separate different groups, or one nation would be one tribe?
I mean the old school type of hunter gatherers where it's literally you and your family or your tribe. The reason why I say this is because, like, I don't know, what was I gonna say? Yeah, in terms of society, I think the way we've developed, we've made a lot of advances in things like tech and economically speaking, and all of that stuff. But have you noticed we've kind of let go of our sense of humanity? The term where everyone's pretty much selfish, like in terms of like even large scale wars. Large scale wars happen because people are unified into groups big enough to fight at that scale. With hunter gatherers, if one or two tribes have a fight, they deal with it themselves. There wouldn't be a larger group behind them that would provide enough weaponry, etc. I think as hunter gatherers, we would hold on to that sense of humanity in terms of everything's more personalized, but we wouldn't be as advanced as we are right now. So, do you think it would be good on a personal level? Would it be good if we stuck as hunter gatherers, or like unify together to make these countries and have these different forms of government?
I think being a hunter gatherer arises so many dormant emotions that we have as human beings that have now become dormant over the years. But it gives rise to emotions that I think would be very detrimental to not only ourselves but the people around us. Because like with hunter gatherers, let's say it's just me and my family. So there's four of us, and every day we have to go out find food for the family for us to survive. Now, I could look at my neighbor, and if I see they have food and my family's dying hungry, I would probably go and try to take the food from my neighbor. Now, chances are the neighbor would want food for the next day to maintain their family. So I think it brings about animosity between two groups, unneeded animosity between two groups. With nations, you can sort of gather behind a flag and have some sort of idea of sharing or preservation, in the sense that you're getting together as a group of families as opposed to a single family for the hope of preservation of human life. Like a nation goes out and tries to minimize the loss of its residents. Like you look at the US wanting to protect American journalists in Iraq during the war. And it sort of just brings about an idea of wanting to protect your neighbor, wanting to protect another family, whether you know them or not, but because you share some sort of tie. When you get rid of that tie, I think it becomes very dangerous, because at that point, what are you working towards? It's just a constant grind for survival as opposed to any sort of progression. And it's not even technologically speaking any kind of emotional progression, because you, without setting up a group of tribes, you're just living every day as a means to an end, which is death. And I think that's my opinion on it. What would you say?
One of my concerns with the idea of hunter gatherers is, this is not really connected to what you said, but the exchange of information and knowledge. Because if you're not unified, your tendencies of sharing knowledge that at this point gives you a benefit over the others, would you be willing to share it with, let's say, your neighbors, or something that gives them power as well? And that you can see that at a national level as well. If you hold particular information, you don't go around sharing it with other countries. You want to have that upper hand. Um, this concept is very complex, but I think on an individual level, we do need a leader. You everyone is not a leader and everyone can't just go on themselves. There's also a reason why some people choose to have office jobs and some people go on to be entrepreneurs. Some people need instructions to carry on, some people make instructions themselves. And I think that's how we eventually went from hunter gatherers to being unified into bigger and bigger groups to eventually become countries and like these nations. But I'm still in favor of the concept of hunter gatherers because I generally feel like life now is overcomplicated. Um, there's always this political stress between countries, etc. There's a lot of factors you have to think about. As hunter gatherers, you don't give a shit about any of those. What you do is look for food, survive, reproduce, move on, die. It's as simple as that. And although I think we've gone on a very different tangent from the idea of leadership, etc., but in that way I think concept of hunter gatherers is better. But I don't know, it really limits humans as well because you need collective effort to do some things or make some changes. And the reason also why we're so technologically advanced is because we've unified together into bigger and bigger groups, shared ideas, etc. So yeah. But I often think about this as well. You know how we the world isn't like peaceful. There are always conflicts because everyone has a different opinion and everyone thinks their opinion is the best or the most efficient or the better one for a particular time for particular people. And so this conflict of opinions is what causes tension, political tension within countries, between countries, etc. And when I was talking about this, I was once questioned by someone, then how do you think unity would be managed in a place like heaven? Like, how could you stop war and fighting there? And my view on that, first of all, just want to point out this is way off topic, but my view on that is if you're religious, you believe God has the ultimate power. His orders, his opinions, his words are law. So in that way, you can't really have different opinions in terms of leadership. You know what is told to you is the best. And then that forms unity. And yeah, like, what do you think about that?
Do you think unity is important as itself, as an entity in itself? Because it's sort of like the parable of the shepherd and the sheep. You can stay following a certain set of instructions under a unified banner, but at what point does it become to the detriment of the sheep?
So it's the same concept. Like, see, you could be following the same leader, but you might have different opinions from like the rest of the sheep. Let's say you're one of the sheep. You have different opinions that can cause conflict. And who do you go to settle your conflict? To the leader, because you value their teachings and their words. And in that case, whatever the ruling given will set either one of the parties like make them like unsatisfied with what's said because they'd still think that their opinion matters or their cause is more valuable. I think in sense of heaven, it's like the perfect justice system in terms that the rule or law given to you is the ultimate rule or law, and it leaves both of the parties satisfied. And in that terms, unity is perfect because everything's peaceful then. There's no conflict of opinions because one entity can settle it all. And in that way, that brings about peace. And that is also why I think there's so many conflicts within our world. No law system is perfect, no leader is perfect. And to some extent, everyone has a bias. And of course, they're humans giving rules to humans. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. Of course, it's not going to work for everyone. There are different philosophies in the world. People choose to believe in different ones. People believe that some are better than the others. There are differences in opinions. That is what shatters unity at the end. Um, during the subcontinent, most Muslims were for the Muslim League because they were unified, because they saw the struggles Muslims face, and they were united to the point where a country like Pakistan was formed. And then there were differences within that unity, that how should this go on then? And so that breaks unity, that causes chaos, that causes conflicts, etc. But in a place like heaven, I think that's like the perfect unity, because the rule you're given is the ultimate rule. You can't argue against it.
But do you think in a place like heaven, the idea of rule would even exist? Because a rule is primarily something that came about, something to make humans more obedient, following a set of rules. But if you followed those, if you believe in heaven, you would have followed a set of rules to get there. And once you get there, is there really a need to follow any rules anymore?
I think that's where there's a division between heaven and hell. So people who followed a certain set of rules will end up in heaven, and so they believe in those rules. They'll continue to follow it, and so that's why there's so much peace there, or said to be like peace there, and no conflict or anything.
But I mean, at the same time, they say that those rules would be nullified within heaven. Like, I mean, speaking primarily of Islam here, like, you'll be able to drink wine, which you're not allowed to do here. Or I mean, it's said that you shouldn't do it here. You're allowed to do it there. So I mean, the rules have suddenly changed, and at the end of the day, if you follow those rules here, and by divine decree, it is said that you're pure enough to enter heaven, and you've entered heaven, the rules have suddenly changed. Is there really even a need to follow anything anymore? I mean, if the ego has been taken out of your existence, I mean, the devil can't be in heaven, of course. So at that point, when you're acting primarily on by a will, which is not your own will, but it's by the will of, let's just call it a greater entity, then is there even a need for rules?
Um, it's a very complicated thing to say and a complicated thing to think about, but I think in a place like heaven, we'd just be programmed in a way to act a specific way and stay within particular boundaries. And like what you said about wine, like drinking or jobi, I mean, in our religion, at least in Assam, it said that the wine would be pure. It wouldn't have the toxin, it wouldn't be intoxicating like it is in this world. And everything would be pure. So I think if we enter heaven, we'd have all the negative things in us taken out. Like in terms that, I don't know, I just think we'd be purified before we go somewhere like that. And so, yeah.
Do you remember we had the discussion on limitation and freedom? How the more choices you have, the less freedom you have. But in society nowadays, it's sort of perceived as the more choice you have, or the more variations of choice you have, generally speaking, the more freedom you have, and you're more free, basically. So in that same sense, if you apply it to this heaven conversation, if you take away all rules, and again, you're living by, let's just assume you're living by a will that is not your own will, it is a will of a greater entity. Maybe that's what it talks about freedom, that once you have no more choices to make, and you're programmed to follow a certain course, then that is the ultimate freedom. Because, I mean, oftentimes in the world today, or if you go back to hunters and gatherers, we always had choices to make, and those choices determine our life or our death. Do you go out to hunt, or do you stay and protect your family because of an inherent risk by another tribe, let's say? In the same way, once you remove that sense of choice, and you know that that choice is now by the will of a greater entity, the right choice, is that the ultimate freedom, even though you have no say in it?
I think when you reach a point like that, you have enough faith that even if you don't have choices, what is chosen for you is the best. Okay? And yeah, I think it just comes down to your faith at that point. Now, a personal question: do you prefer having multiple options or to be struck down to just one path? Because personally, when I don't have any other options left, I feel frustrated that I want to do something else. But when I have a bunch of options in front of me, it's so difficult to choose. At that moment, I hope for just one path that I can just follow. What's that like for you?
I would prefer just the one option or the one path, because generally speaking, the majority of decisions that I have made thus far in my life have been according to a certain set of guidelines or principles, whether those be religious, societal, those taught to me by my mother, whatever. But I follow some strict principles, and those eliminate any kind of choice I have. Like, I know when the day starts, I know that no matter what happens today, if I have a choice between milk and wine, I drink the milk because I don't drink alcohol. So it sort of eliminates the choice in that sense. And that, again, as we were talking about previously, takes away a lot of the stress I have and the frustration, because I know that what I'm doing, whether it's right or wrong, is the way I should be doing it. But then at the same time, the question arises, I mean, this is very off topic again, but do we do things for our perceived benefit, or do we do them because our fathers and mothers have done them before us, or we have been doing them for a long time?
Um, I think, okay, so you know how a lot of times we tend to think that, oh, we want to be different from our parents, we want to make different decisions, but in the end, if you look at yourself, you realize you're a lot like them. In that way, I think the environment you've grown into, um, what you think is beneficial for you is pretty much what they would have thought in that position. So you're doing both. You're thinking what's beneficial for you, and you're acting a certain way which you were taught by the people around you. So in that way, it's like a false sense of freedom because you're programmed that way. You are going to choose that option, and at the end, you realize I didn't really have an option. I was born a particular way with particular views, which were very similar to them. Even though I tried to move against it, I ended up making the same decisions. And the thing that sets us apart from parents or the people around us who played a role in us becoming who we are is in some places, yes, we made different decisions that made us unique. But towards the core, I think we act almost the same way. So,
This is, again, you mentioned the idea about having a benefit. So that sort of sparked in my mind, okay, who should the ultimate benefit be towards? Because there are so many different perspectives to any choice we make. It may be very good for us, and it may be the worst thing ever for another individual. Now, let's say we were, this is a very abstract thing, let's say we were standing in an empty room with a million different mirrors all pointed towards us, and we flash a light. We want that light to be, we want the reflection of that light in one of the mirrors to be as bright as possible. And now, one of the mirrors, and now let's say you take out the human being flashing the light, and the individual flashing the light is in fact a mirror. Fine. Then you have our perspective, you have the perspective of a million different individuals, you have God's perspective if you believe in God or a greater entity, you have the perspective of this earth, you have the perspective of nature. Do you think there is a way in which we can determine the best choice to make, which is in the best interests of every single mirror, so that the reflection of the light is as bright in each mirror as possible? Or do you think giving benefit to one of those mirrors takes away from the benefit of others in each and every situation?
I think in the end, we'd have to prioritize some mirrors or some individuals over others. And that's where I think as humans we're flawed in being fair and all, because we don't have that power, I guess, mentally. And so in the end, even in real life, you can never do something that benefits everyone. And that comes back to the idea of ruling and leading. As a leader, you will have to make the decision, a tough decision, which maximizes the benefit for everyone in the future. But in the end, you leave some people unsatisfied and some people not taken care of or some people unheard. And that is also why any form of leadership is flawed. Because, I mean, you can't give the brightest light to each and every mirror. There will be some mirrors that are completely dim, some which get some light, and then there will be some that have like the most intense light. So, good way to bring it back to the initial topic. But I think that's why also our government systems are flawed. As humans, we can't make decisions that benefit everyone because everyone is different. Unlike the mirrors, which are probably made from the same material by the same manufacturer, um, installed by the same people using the same method, humans are different. Each of us have different needs, different perspectives, different opinions, etc. Everything is subjective. So in the end, you can never make a decision that is beneficial for everyone. There will always be some people left unsatisfied. And almost time's up, so I think this is our ending like sentences. So
I was just gonna ask a question. Do you think there's a form of perfect opinion, an opinion unhindered by bias or any sort of defect?
no. Okay. um no, to be honest, no. I don't think it comes down to that same idea. All of us are so different and so unique, and our minds work in such different ways. Like, for example, if someone believes in absurdism, they believe life has no purpose and is just chaos. And then there's a religious individual that goes like, no, life has so much, like life has a purpose. There's so many meanings to life. There's a bigger picture and everything. The idea being everyone has different opinions, different ways of perceiving the same image or the same information provided to them. There can't be an ultimate opinion. Like, you have the best of the best leaders, you have the best of the best religious individuals like prophets. There's always a group or always an individual that opposes the opinions and ideas presented, because we're just all unique, we're all very different. So yeah, and that's also what I think makes the world so interesting. So yeah, thank you for listening. This was a good and interesting conversation, I think. And I think I'm going to try and make an effort to record more in person podcasts, because I think the conversation has a more natural run to it. But yeah, thank you for listening. Like and subscribe and share this. And please listen to the other ones as well. Thank you.